audience, Mr. Z here. John F. Kennedy, a macho womanizing stud who conquered the moon. At least that's what the documentaries say. There are a lot of misunderstandings about JFK's capabilities, his ideals, and his effectiveness as a president. In summary, and to put it politely, JFK's presidential legacy is grossly over-exaggerated. It lasted 2 goddamn years, folks. It is believed by some that had Kennedy never been assassinated in Dallas, he would go on to radically change the United States in all manner of ways. I've seen countless hypotheticals that suggest anything from a victory in Vietnam to a complete failure of the civil rights movement, and even something involving the Irish Mafia of all things. In truth, and I'm sure a good few of you would know this, had Kennedy survived in Dallas, not much would have changed. The most realistic changes to come from an alternate timeline in which Kennedy survived his assassination would be the securing of more government positions for his family members, as he had displayed a fair deal of nepotism during his presidency. Likely a softer approach to the Vietnam War, perhaps not even escalating it to the level of a war, as had been done with Cuba. Kennedy wasn't exactly one for flat-out aggression, and I'm sure some people are going to tell me in the comments that's not true, but he wasn't somebody who would instigate a war to that degree. He's somebody who was very, very conscious of the Cold War situation of mutually assured destruction and didn't want it to escalate to that level, which is why something like a proxy war really wouldn't suit his style. Finally, and as other historians have pointed out, we'd see a slowing of the civil rights movement on account of the greater effort and efficiency put into the matter by Lyndon B. Johnson, which Kennedy simply couldn't match because, well, Johnson is a little bit like a mobster in that he was calling in favors from all his friends. Johnson, little bit of a greasy president, in my opinion. I'm an American, folks. But back to Kennedy. Kennedy simply couldn't match that which Johnson brought to the table. However, granted the very matter of what Kennedy was, he was, in the eyes of many people, a challenge to the establishment. He was the first Catholic U.S. president. He was seen as an icon of leveling the field, of pushing for equality, and given his popularization of the Nation of Immigrants slogan and his brother Ted Kennedy's promotion of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, which opened America's doors to immigrants of all countries instead of primarily Europe, we'd see Kennedy campaign for civil rights and push them further along, if not politically, then at the very least socially. However, overall, Kennedy would have been a fairly forgettable president, his only remarkable feature really being that he was a Catholic, as his policies weren't all too remarkable or noteworthy, leaving him to be something of a semi-obscure, if not poor president in the eyes of history. Yes, he was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis and averted what could have been a disaster, but so were other presidents during the period. And we don't exactly hear much of things like the Poplar Tree Incident, or any of the various things that happened under Reagan. So what we're left with is a generally boring alternate timeline. But that's no fun at all. So, just for the sake of this scenario, suppose that on November 22nd of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald takes aim at JFK and manages to shoot him, but fails to kill him. Kennedy is rushed to a hospital to treat his wounds, but he's up and ready to return to office the following day. Kennedy is both shocked and reinvigorated by the event, more determined than ever to make his presidency matter. And don't think I'm just pulling this out of a rat's hat here. I'm basing this on as much fact as I possibly can, and going whole hog with it, if you will. Jack Ruby, never being motivated by Kennedy's death, doesn't shoot Oswald, leaving him to face trial and expose him as a radical communist agent. This being based on his past sympathies to the Soviet Union, his trips to the Cuban embassy in Mexico, his prolonged stay in the Soviet Union, his past dissemination of pro-communist propaganda, and his Section 8 discharge from the Marines, which he received after suggesting that he would leak American secrets to the Soviets. The idea that Oswald was actually operating at the whim of the Soviets or Cuba to assassinate the US president would also lead to a massive controversy. Such a thing could lead to a heightening of Cold War tensions unseen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even greater. However, if we contrast this with excerpts from Oswald's journal in which he states he attempted to kill himself after being denied Soviet citizenship, and his later disillusionment with Soviet life, this would lead many to the impression that Oswald was in fact unstable. Pair this with Oswald's desire for media attention following his return to the US from the USSR, and disappointment at how little he received, it could be shown that Oswald was a delusional man desperate for attention. Further, it could be asserted that the attempt on Kennedy's life was one of pure opportunity, as months prior, Oswald had attempted to assassinate a retired US Major General, only to strike him in the arm. Oswald's wife would later testify that Oswald had ranted about wanting to kill the general because he was, as Oswald put it, the leader of a fascist organization. Further investigation would also show that Oswald had desperately tried to inject himself into the operations of pro-communist groups, such as the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and most notably when he vied desperately for Soviet citizenship. Even though these groups would continuously turn him down and had no interest in him, he would persist. In one letter he wrote to the FPCC after they'd rejected his offer to help open a new office in New Orleans, he wrote, "Against your advice, I have decided to take an office from the very beginning." After a long period of Cold War tenseness, it would become clear that Oswald was but a loner who wanted to feel important by joining the opposition team, only to realize that they didn't want him at all, and his attempt on Kennedy's life was just a desperate, misguided attempt to get attention, thus resolving any heightened tensions between the US, Cuba, and USSR. But, with such actions coming from a clear-cut communist laid out for America to see, we'd likely find a revival of McCarthyism and a flaring of anti-communist sentiment within the US, snuffing out the rise of the counterculture movement before it even started. What this leaves us with is a more passionate John F. Kennedy, a more radicalized American public, no hippies in America, maybe no Vietnam War, and, well, let's see what else we can do. Kennedy would take a hardline approach to communism within the US, and his more liberal values would shrink under the intensity of anti-communist idealism. The Hart-Celler Act, in an attempt to keep communist elements from leaking into the US, would be dismissed in favor of the McCarran-Walter Act, which focused immigration sources on Britain, West Germany, and Ireland. Kennedy was throughout his presidency against getting the US involved in wars. However, the spirit of defeating the USSR would propel him to find another means of accomplishing that. Thus, the space race is kicked into overdrive. NASA, receiving far greater funding, which would have been siphoned off during the Vietnam War, is, with Kennedy's determination, set to land a man on the moon before the end of his second term. And in 1966, a full 3 years ahead of schedule, it is done. Kennedy would set a new precedent for the United States and space exploration, leading the next 2 decades to put a heavy emphasis in asserting American dominance of both Earth and space. And such a thing could only be accomplished once space, too, was a land of the free. You know what I'm getting at here. Moon colonies as far as the eye can see. We'd choose to go to the moon and build moon colonies not because it's easy, not because it's hard, but because it's easy for us and because it's hard for you. The process would begin by launching more and more regular missions to the moon in order to drop off supplies and all the necessary ingredients needed to build something as preposterous as a moon colony. The Soviets, in their mad dash to reach the moon, would likely begin the first of many failed rocket launches until, in 1968, a station capable of temporarily housing American astronauts would be successfully built, with an emergency oxygen supply, food rations, and all manner of bits and bobs. Kennedy's presidency would come to an end, and because in this timeline nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys, JFK continues to watch over NASA and direct some operations within the agency, while Robert Francis Kennedy would earn the Democratic nomination for presidency and go on to run against Nixon. It's a little foggy as to who would win, because America would certainly become more socially conservative following Oswald's trial, but sympathies for Kennedy would also be high. If not for his party, then at very least for his family and name, so it could really go either way. But there's also the matter that we Americans aren't too fond of presidential dynasties like the Clintons or Bushes, as well as the fact that Nixon had won the election in our timeline, but it's still kind of hazy. Was this scenario a bit of a stretch? Well, yes, but it's also been a pretty fun ride. It'd be disappointing to say that Kennedy's presidency, had he survived, would be fairly unremarkable, because there's such a romanticized idea of Kennedy, of him embodying a diplomatic approach to the Cold War, and a spirit of a new generation. But realistically, and point by point, there wasn't much Kennedy did to significantly improve the country, nor would he have been able to, knowing the kind of man that he was. But it's lots of fun to speculate and just make a crazy story. You've got to admit, this was a pretty damn good story. And with that said, I think that's where I'll end the video. The US of Z, thanks for watching. Support your legion by liking the video or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.